Hello, I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel, Disability Visibility, as part of Court International Festival of Literature and in partnership with Arts and Disability Ireland. My name is Jody O'Neill. I'm an autistic writer, actor, editor, and activist. I will be the moderator for today's event. And I feel hugely privileged to be here today with Alice Wong, editor of the anthology Disability Visibility, First Person Stories from the 21st Century, which was published in June 2020 like a shining light in the midst of the COVID gloom. And also with Alice Sheppard and Eugene Grant, two of over 35 contributors whose words and thoughts make up the content of this rich and diverse publication. Through individual personal stories and reflections on themes like love, grief, identity, beauty, creativity, hope, pain, access, discrimination, eugenics, cures, parenting, role models, faith, stigma, clothing, climate change, and more, the publication forms a nuanced picture of the intersectional landscape of disability culture in the 21st century. So I'd like to begin by introducing Alice, Eugene, and Alice. Alice Wong, pronouns she, her, is a disabled activist, media maker, and consultant. She is the founder and director of the Disability Visibility Project, an online community dedicated to creating, sharing, and amplifying disability media and culture. Alice Sheppard is a dancer, choreographer, and writer. She is the founder and artistic lead for Kinetic Light, a project-based ensemble working at the intersections of disability, dance, design, identity, and technology to create transformative art and advance the intersectional disability arts movement. Eugene Grant is a part-time writer and activist in the dwarfism community. Based in Northeast England, he has written and spoken about dwarfism and disability in a number of books and UK international and online media outlets. Welcome and thank you so much to all three of you for joining us here today. First of all, for those who may not be familiar with your work, Alice Wong, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and about the initial creation and development of the Disability Visibility Project back in 2014.
Thanks so much for moderating this conversation, Jody. I'm delighted to be part of this festival. This is amazing in the sense that here we are, still not out of the pandemic, and I'm able to be with many people who are in Ireland and abroad and just all over the world thanks to technology like this, but also, most importantly, the fact that festivals, conferences, and other major arts organizations have really finally caught up with disabled people and, really realized that the remote options, the online options that many of us have been fighting for, now is the time. And it's a bit bittersweet that there's a global pandemic of hundreds of thousands of deaths and infections for people to hopefully become a little bit more aware of the value of accessibility. So I just want to lay that out there and ground us at this particular moment because this is a historic moment. And I think it's going to be many years until we're really going to be able to process it. I started the Disability Visibility Project in 2014 because in the United States at that time, we were preparing for the 25th anniversary of one of our major disability rights law called the ADA, which stands for the Americans with Disabilities Act. The 25th anniversary was coming up in 2015, and I thought to myself, well, I'm just one person. What did I do? What should I do that's unique? How can I give back? And one of the biggest pet peeves of mine is the fact that we're still not taught our history, and our culture is still not taught in, secondary school, much less colleges. And it really bothered me that, we're not creating the history of the Hira Dao. Whatever disability history there is out there in the United States, at least, it's very much, rooted in the past, but I really wanted to make history alive and relevant. So the DVP started off as a 1-year oral history campaign. And, it really snowballed. It really tapped into a hunger that disabled people felt. They wanted to tell their own story. And then a few years later, I branched out. I have a blog. I started a podcast in 2017, and I just did my 100th episode just this week. So that's a thing. And I came out with the anthology last year. So everything's been very gradual, but very rewarding.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. It's an incredibly important project because I think we don't hear, and certainly in Ireland, we haven't heard enough disabled stories told through disabled voices. So it's fantastic to hear about the power of one person and how that can snowball into a movement. For Alice Sheppard, I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about your own journey into the world of disability arts and specifically into dance? Because I think that I read that you started out in quite a different field. Is that right?
That's right. Thank you, Jody. Thank you for the invitation to be here and for the generous introduction. I'm really happy to be in this digital space with Eugene and Alice. It's rather cool. I used to be a professor of medieval studies, and that was where I imagined that I had worked all my life to be, and I had imagined that I would spend my life in the academy, perhaps in a garret, writing incredibly well-informed, nuanced books and articles as scholars, I imagined, did. And I was on that pathway when I became disabled. And of course, that changes the story significantly. With joy and pleasure, I discovered other disabled people and other disabled artists. And that's how I got started dancing, in fact. I had been to a conference on disability in the university, and there was a performance by dancer Homer Avila to conclude the conference. And as part of that, he had asked that members of the audience read text for him so he could dance, and I was reading some of the text. And afterwards in the bar, we fell into conversation about the work, about disability and art, and how it didn't have to be this kind of inclusionary, compensatory, adaptive kind of thing. And so we talked about integrity and rigor and virtuosity and all of these things, and other disabled artists that we had read of or known, whose work we had seen in all the fields. And then at the end of the evening, when a couple of others had gathered, and he issued a dare for us to take a dance class. And then he turned to me specifically and he said he dared me to take a dance class. And of course, I was a couple of glasses of red wine in, and the perils of alcohol, perhaps. But of course, I said yes, because I'll take a dare. That's me. After that, the dare didn't seem to mean anything. 6 weeks later, of course, I didn't know it, and many people there at the time didn't know it. But this had been his last performance. Homer was dead. And I just felt like I needed to honor that dare. It was, but then the journey, the pathway to coming into dance is as a disabled artist is, or want to be a disabled artist, it's not like you could apply to a conservatory. You don't have the training to apply to a conservatory. And so, which is what I would have done. I spent my childhood from 3 to 18 performing music. And, I was imagining that I would go to music college, and I knew the pathway, I knew the structure. As someone wanting to become a dancer, there was no familiar pathway or structure. And my attempts at getting lessons were horrendous. I found other disabled dancers and became an apprentice at Axis and studied with Kitty Lunn. And all of a sudden, I was integrated into the disability world, and I knew that that's where I wanted to stay.
Fantastic. Thank you. I know because before I knew that I was a disabled artist, tried to become a ballet dancer at age 15, and the pathway in as a supposedly non-disabled artist was tricky enough. So yeah, it's not an easy form to penetrate. So thanks for that, Alice. Eugene, you describe yourself as a part-time writer and activist. Would you be willing to share some of the story of what brings you here today?
Sure, absolutely. Well, firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. It's such an honour to be here and take part and to be among the contributors to Alice's book. I'm genuinely very honoured. So I have been, for the last few years, taking a bit of a break for the pandemic, and also because I've got a baby daughter now, but been telling, trying to tell not only my story, my lived experience as someone with dwarfism, but also to try and shine a spotlight on disability history, specifically dwarfism-related history. I grew up hearing all about kind of stereotypes and caricatures like the Seven Dwarfs, like Mini-Me from Austin Powers, and it was only when I was 30 did I learn that one of the first radical white abolitionists in history had dwarfism. One of the greatest jazz drummers of all time had dwarfism. It was only when I started looking into this that I actually found this, and I felt kind of, not just for myself and my own sense of discovery, but almost a duty to try and amplify these stories and shine a light on them, because the focus on stereotypes and caricatures is so great and so big, and these real stories are so sidelined and so marginalized. So my kind of part-time work is revolves around trying to amplify these and trying to bring them to the fore, and try to bring about a world where more people know about Benjamin Lay than they do about Mini-Me, and more people know about Eliza Suggs than they do about Dopey and Doc. So that's some of the work that I try and do.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And congratulations on your baby.
Thank you.
That's great news. So to come back to the anthology is divided into 4 sections: being, belonging, doing, and connecting. And these words really resonate with me as an autistic person who was diagnosed in later life, but always carried a sense of difference, of deviation from the accepted norm. And I feel that these words, in a sense, describe my journey in recent years, from the getting along as best I could manage, being, to the discovery of my community, belonging, to beginning to make work articulating my experiences and those of my community, doing, and now connecting with others who are doing similar work in order to galvanize and organize. But can I ask you, Alice Wong, after that long preamble, why you chose these 4 words: being, belonging, doing, connecting, and then how did you go about curating the contributions into these sections?
Yeah, I think the sections came afterwards. So first, to me, I really wanted to put together a real mix, a real diversity of thoughts, diversity of perspectives, of lives. So it was going to be a very difficult anthology to categorize or to organize in some way. And, I thought about what are some larger kind of ways of being, just different modalities and kind of broader things that would work for so many different kinds of pieces. For example, there wasn't going to be like a way to characterize, like, there aren't 5 pieces on relationships, things like that. They're just, there are so many pieces that are singular. I was trying to be intentional with that too, because this is not a long book, this is not a big book. So I had to be really selective. I was really focused on capturing some of the most important issues of our time: climate justice, racial justice, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement. And I will say that when Eugene's piece came out, it was published, I think, a few years ago. I learned a lot about Benjamin Lay as a really just a part of Quaker history, a part of British history, but also such an important part of disability history. And this is another callback to history, right? Like that, disabled people they've always been here, right? We've always been here throughout history, throughout time. It's just the fact that many historians, or just even during those times, they just never used that word, or just used other words. So I think some of the Eugene's piece was bringing in the historical parts that I really wanted to share with people. And I will say with Alice, I really lucky to have known Alice. She's also lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we've kind of crossed paths, and I'm a real admirer of Alice. Not just because we share the first name, but Alice's are awesome. We'll just put that out there. We joked about this before in an email. I was like, Alice's are just awesome. So just gonna bring that up now. But I was a real admirer of Kinetic Flight, and a piece that Alice and Laurel Lawson, a choreographer and dancer as well, collaborated together, called Descent. And I really wanted the chance for Alice to write an original essay for the book. Most of the pieces in the anthology are previously published pieces from the 21st century. So that's the year 2000 to 2019. There are about 5 original essays as well. And I just want to say how thankful I am that both Eugene allowed me to reprint his blog post. I mean, there's something about Benjamin Lay that I'm also filled with gratitude that Alice took the time to write this incredible, beautiful, powerful essay titled So Not Broken. Which, I think that title just says it all, but I'm just so delighted to be able to have this privilege of putting together this book. It is my hope that people will find comfort and feel seen.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yes, I think people will find comfort and feel safe. And I think there's also something quite transformative about each and every piece of work, and what each piece brings to the whole collection overall, and the individual impact, and then the collective impact of the work. You've touched a little bit on this already, Eugene, just in relation to your essay, The Fearless Benjamin Lay. And I suppose it's just around the importance of role models, and how important do all 3 of you feel that positive disabled role models are, not just for the disability community, to see ourselves represented and to see ourselves achieving and changing history, but also for the rest of the world to see the benefit that can come from traditionally marginalized voices being included in conversations. So I wonder, maybe we'll go to you first, Eugene, and then if Alice or Sheppard or Alice Wong would like to add in, that would be great too.
Thank you. I think disabled role models are hugely important, and they're hugely important in two ways. What mostly around challenging assumptions. One for kind of the world that has the non-disabled world that has so often stereotyped or marginalized or written us off or written our own stories, our own narratives for us and told us what we could be rather than what we are or what we can be. And the other is our own internal stories, our own internal beliefs. You know, if you have, I know of people in the dwarfism community who I've experienced this myself, who've been told that we can make good money doing pantomime. And I've heard parents have experienced this of that their children have been told these kind of things as well. And if you don't then have in your own mind as a dwarf and disabled child, I'm using my own point of reference specifically as dwarfism, but this applies to all disability, your own role models to kind of combat those assumptions, then you're going to begin to build a negative viewpoint of yourself and what you can do. And so these role models are so powerful for challenging both kind of the wider assumptions about the disability community, but also our own internal narratives as well. That's partly why I started a project called Role Models in the Dwarfism Community, which is spotlighting a whole range of lives, from doctors to athletes. We have marathon runners to policy directors to academics and professors. So not only to try and break apart some of these stereotypes in the wider world, but also to show people in the disability and dwarfism community, look, here's what you can be. You don't have to be what other people tell you to be. You can be anything. I hope that makes sense.
It makes absolute sense. Yeah. Yes, of course, go ahead.
No, to you,
I wanted to mention, in keeping with this theme, the idea of representation, and I hope it's okay to quote from your introduction to the anthology, Alice. But I think it's important for people to hear that you say, I believe I am living in a time where disabled people are more visible than ever before. And yet, while representation is exciting and important, it is not enough. I want and expect more. We should all expect more. We all deserve more. There must be depth, range, nuance to disability representation in media. And this resonated so strongly with me, and even more so because I was reading it at a time when there was a lot of coverage in the Irish media about the return to school after our COVID Christmas wave for children with disabilities and additional needs. So disability was in the news more than it's probably ever been before, but with the exception of a few advocacy groups and one amazing interview I heard with Steve Daunt, who's a disabled journalist, who was rightly calling for the abolition of the term special needs. Much of what was represented in the media were the voices of parents. And for me, this did more harm than good to the visibility and perceptions of disability in Ireland. So how can media and culture do better, do you think? We could go to you first, Alice Wong, and then Alice Sheppard.
Well, I think every industry, every field, frankly, has a really long way to go. I think this is why I think, ableism is systemic. We have to, dismantle it, and this has me dismantle white supremacy. I think this is, the world that is truly structured. And the only way it changes is if we work toward change, demand change, and also just, keep pushing our so-called good allies to do the damn work, right? I think it takes a collective efforts. So that's what I'm looking forward to, and that's what I'm trying to work toward. And, I do this knowing that I'm part of a larger community. I'm part of a larger movement. And I think that's what is really necessary in order for change to happen. And as we go throughout time, things don't change overnight. Things are really slow and glacial. But I do think that in particular, let's say, in popular culture, things have somewhat improved, but not all that much, especially, let's say, media coverage. There are very few journalists or publishers or editors to, let's say, identify as disabled. And I think the same for pop culture. I mean, how many times are we going to have the same very, superficial, stereotypical roles, and then for still the majority of them, they're played by non-disabled actors. I mean, here we are in 2021, and this is still not seen as a problematic practice that should absolutely end. But people love to debate. People love to have both sides. I talked about creative freedom. Nobody's saying you can't have different perspectives. But when you have a history of systemically excluding and discriminating against disabled people, when all they want is a chance, it's about equity, and I think it's about justice. And we still, I think, don't have equity or justice just yet. And if I could just go back and mention a little bit about your question on role models, I would say that instead of using the word role model, I think I'm much more interested in kind of, I would say, authentic lived experiences, because sometimes I think role models are absolutely important in terms of giving a positive portrayal, but I'm also interested in really messy portrayals and, difficult and, not so great ones, because, we're not here to sugarcoat or gloss over the very real pain and suffering and challenges. I think any young person, if they're born disabled or become disabled, I think having realistic ideas of what a disability experience is like is absolutely imperative in terms of just giving people a sense of being reflected. Because I think there's still a lot of pressure to be a good role model, to play into respectability politics, where we have to hide a lot of the messy, frankly, traumatic and gross and sad parts that are absolutely part of who we are as well. And I think that's something that I look for as well. Just keeping the messiness, but also our gloriousness. Yeah, we can be both. We can be all things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think there can be a huge sense if everybody is putting their best self out all the time, then there's a huge danger of creating an unrealistic picture and actually doing harm in terms of people who are experiencing pain, people who are struggling, people who feel like, oh, maybe I should be achieving, having a profound sense of failure. And I think that can be, just as damaging. So it's a really important point to make. And thank you for making it, Alice. Alice Sheppard, would you like to contribute on that question?
I would, certainly would, if I could. Listen, I think this is with the deepest respect to the question. This is the question itself I find personally toxic and reinforcing of all of the structures of ableism that make our lives so complicated in the first place. So I would rather say, what on earth can we do to dismantle the world that requires there to be the idea or the perception of a role model? I'm much more interested in that as a question. I am much more interested in taking apart the ways in which the world is built, that it even becomes necessary to ask that question. I am much more interested, I'm not interested in being your learning experience. Right? I am not interested in my life, and that's part of the problem, right? Because all of a sudden it becomes about my life and my personhood and my embodiment and not about my art. I'm not interested in my life and my personhood becoming this kind of thing that you can put in a 250-word potted biography of, this is the life of a disabled dancer. Here's your blog post. Here's your TV cameo. That's not interesting to me. I want to take down the world. I want to build new worlds in which we understand politics, culture, our history. I don't, you know, I want to understand the aesthetics of disability. And the problem with the mainstream non-disabled world is that it is so uneducated in disability that it only imagines that we can be ourselves. Right? The thing that we have to contribute is ourselves, our life patterns. That there's history, there's work, there's art, there's cultural production, there's messiness. And thank you, Alice Wong, for that. Yeah. The imagination that we need role models is exactly the manifestation of structural ableism.
Well, I want to add to that.
In that world.
Yeah, and I want to add to that, Alice. I think the thing about role models is the fact that in many ways it's a trap, but also, you know, I think it's also about this scarcity model, right? That, you know, marginalized communities have to fight for the fucking scraps, then we have to be grateful for the fucking scraps. And that's the problem. And then as a community, so many of us have to worry about how we look to the outside world, that we actually do embrace and want to put our best face forward, because clearly we are all also not immune to ableism, right? And respectability policies. We want to be seen and approved and tacitly accepted. And I think, again, the word acceptance and inclusion, you know, on whose terms, right? I think that's a question I'd love to ask all of you, because on whose terms are we supposed to be palatable? Because isn't that really what acceptance is? It's being palatable to, for example, neurotypical cultures, non-disabled cultures, cis whites, heteronormative cultures. So, you know, I think that's, to me, the whole trappings of capitalism, which makes us feel like, number one, we're not enough, we're never doing enough, that our worth is always tied to our production, but also this scarcity model, which is an entire hoax, right? Because I think, as we all know here, the four of us, that there is such abundance within our particular communities that we're part of. But I think we're made to feel like we have to choose one or the other, right? And I think that's where that's false. And I think we have to alert these things, that we find ourselves all the time, that we have to alert these things. So that's my kind of thought based on your thoughts.
I'll say yes to that.
Thank you. We've talked a little bit already about community, and Alice Wong, in your introduction, you talk about community. You say that community is magic, community is power, community is resistance. And what I loved most about the book was the growing sense of community I felt as I read through it. And it was of a much bigger community than I'm used to experiencing. And it can be often the case, I think, that identities are compartmentalized. Certainly in Ireland, culturally, we are behind in terms of the intersectionality of identities, and something that is coming more and more into the conversation. But reading through disability visibility, through the cumulative impact of the individual contributions, I felt I was experiencing a much bigger picture, and each person's voice expressed an individual experience, but the overall impact was much greater than the sum of its parts, just like a real community can be, and just like we're discovering an online community can be. And so I suppose my question is, and I guess it ties into that idea of, not maybe moving away, and it's my bad that question is poorly phrased in relation to role models, and I think it probably comes from a lived experience of living 40 years trying to pass
Yeah, that's
in
okay.
your typical world. But I suppose, do you think that it's important that we recognize these intersections more and more so that we're organizing as a larger group? Or do you feel like there's a risk of individual groups' values and priorities becoming diluted within a larger cohort?
Mm.
Maybe we'll go to you first, Alice Wong.
Yeah, I feel like I don't know if there's like a I think we should do both. We should like definitely value both. And there is tension, but I think would you embrace that tension and acknowledge it? I do think the reason why I was very intentional with the people and the choices I made in this book is the fact that I'm really tired of being one of the few Asian American disabled people that other white disabled people know. Like, this is like the bane of my existence. And, I think I can't speak for Ireland, but I probably assume that most of the disability community or representation is overwhelmingly white, but like, you won't mind to say that, but in America, I think, the people considered disability rights leaders and people who are considered proud members of the disability community, it's a very white space. And historically, the movement has been very white, and and I think that's part of the erasure. The erasure and invisibility of disabled people of color who have been part of every community, right? Just existing in Black communities, existing in Asian communities. I think that's just, the problem is people either don't care or they're not looking. And frankly, I think there's a lot of both, right? I think that disability communities have to really to reflect on their own racism, their own sexism and homophobia. That's the intersectionality that's I'm very interested in terms of prejudice within disability communities, because I think it's way overdue. And just because you're oppressed by your ableism does not make you immune to oppressing others and causing harm to others. And, I think if you don't value the wisdom and very unique experiences of multiply marginalized disabled people, then you cannot call yourself, well, I'm just going to say, you can't call yourself an ally or an activist, or somebody who quote unquote cares about social justice. Just like, take that word right out of your mouth. So that's, probably did not answer your question, but That's just by fire.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fire,
That answers it.
fire for you all.
Thank you for it. I guess on that, something that I came across recently was a note at the beginning of a collection of essays called All the Weight of Our Dreams on Living Racialized Autism, and called A Note on Process. The editor, Lydia X. Brown, says that the editorial focus was on substance over style. And she explains that oftentimes editing that focuses too much on proper spelling, grammar, punctuation, and other aspects of language only reinforces white, wealthy, educated norms of language and communication, while devaluing and erasing language uses of racialized, poor, and working class and un or informally educated people. And I've worked a lot as an editor and proofreader in the past, so I have spent hours poring over publications for grammatical and spelling errors. And I was really struck by this process. And I've been thinking about it a lot over the past few months. And I wondered what you all think about it as writers or editors. Do you think that there's an argument for editorial processes to change in this way, so that we've become less hung up on how things are, on the form, and more and embrace the content more?
Yeah, I would say that even for this book, this anthology, working with the publisher, as you all know, I have a number of neurodivergent contributors, and going through the edits that I made, but also the edits that my publisher made, there was a copy editor that just, said, this, why is this capitalized? Or why is this a run-on sentence? And I basically said to them, this is their style of communication. This is like who they are, how they want to express themselves in language. And I will not have you change their words. And I made a point to do that because I would not feel comfortable asking that writer or those writers to change it. I want to preserve their voice and what they want to say as best as I can. And I think there's style guides are just a guide, right? They're just a guide. And I don't think a book is better the more you adhere to a style guide, and I think we need more people in publishing who are, like editors, publishers, copy editors, and, frankly, we see, hopefully we think of, language in a much more fluid way. I mean, like, why don't we think about it like poetry? Poetry is experimental. Why can't the way disabled people write and communicate be seen as the same way rather than something that's non-normative? Why can't we see it as radical and avant-garde versus something that needs to be fixed?
Yeah. Can I also, this is when we tie grammar to, we have unconsciously tied what we think of as correct grammar to quality of communication. If it's not grammatically correct, somehow the thought is not worth focusing on, right? So, the stakes of grammar in disability community get tied to capacity. Like, I can produce a grammatically correct sentence means that I have more chance of being understood as brilliant, right? If I were to produce a grammatically incorrect sentence, it doesn't get read as a grammatically incorrect sentence. It gets reflected as a reflection of a capacity and ability. So the ableist stakes of grammar are high. And what I would also say to that is grammar is racialized. Right? Black English is its thing. And the whiteness of grammar erases the intersectional notion of disability and race. If I were to speak or write in a form that was both Black and, say, neurodivergent, that would immediately, in the hands of someone dedicated to enforcing the rules of grammar and punctuation, that might well have me be reflected on as being not capable of writing, or that my race somehow made me less capacious, less intellectual. The stakes here are high. And, I'm an English professor, right? I love grammar. I spend a lot of my time teaching the grammar of medieval languages. But the notion of grammar and language is what has connected us from recognizing sign language as languages and cultures, right? The stakes and the politics of communication go beyond where you put a semicolon. They just do. We've got to get away. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I interrupted you. Go ahead.
I was on a rant. I was on a rant.
Well, you're inspiring. Just, I was just say, this is why disabled writers have such a hard time getting anything published, right? Because of the judgments, because of the presumptions, exactly what you just said. I mean, not just even articles or op-eds. How many? I think one thing I would love to see is like more disabled columnists, like various papers. Like, I think I'm aware of like Francis Ryan from The Guardian, but much less like books. Like books are even more difficult, right? Like there's so many actual structural and just attitudinal barriers that just tracking it is so difficult. And the fact that we still do not have a ton of disabled journalists, a ton of disabled editors, all of this, anything, I think that speaks to the very real, probably very explicit, but also implicit discrimination about our writing and about our work.
Yeah, and I think it starts, I think it starts so early on in people's lives in the education system that we're, forcing people through a process that isn't really adapted in any way to suit their different mind or their different needs and I think if we could start to think more imaginatively about education, because I feel like we're losing writers and we're losing them at, we're not losing them at post-grad level, we're losing them at 6 or 7 or 8 years of age when they realize this system is not made for me. And I think that's a huge loss of richness and an ecology of literature that I hope will find its way through, and does find its way through, but only in a very small minority of publications. Eugene, would you like to contribute anything on that question? I know we're kind of getting tight for time, so we'll wrap up soon, but I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well, just listening to Alice and Alice's thoughts, it kind of struck me that there's such a thin line between, editing grammar, say, and changing someone's voice. And when you begin to change their voice, then you begin to edit their experience. When you begin to edit their experience, you can edit out their experience, where you can decide what's palpable and what's not, or what's important and what's not, what has value and what doesn't. And it leads me to remind me of a quote. I think it's Ijio Omaluo who asked, "Who owns the representation?" And you can get to a point where somebody else then owns the representation of you, a disabled person, or any intersection in between. And then that becomes quite dangerous because that person is then in charge of your story or your experience, how you articulate that. We were talking about acceptance and tolerance and how these are power words and how that's up to somebody else to decide. Someone else is in power there, not you. And in this question here, it's kind of, who then gets to decide if you're written or recorded or your story has value. And it takes us to very, very messy territory. It's a very difficult one.
Can I ask you a question? About representation.
Me?
Yeah. Sorry, Jody. It's just so far down the line, slave and thought. Like, what if representation is the problem? Right?
What do you mean?
What if because I think I was struck when you were still talking about like your image being taken or used, or Alice when you were talking about casting, right? The problem with representation is it takes one for all. It's a metonymic approach, right? It understands that there is a larger community, but I'm going to take this one, and that will be the representation. I'm going to take this photo, this static moment, this image, and hold it as a representation. If you don't analyze it as representation, but as instance of culture, do you not invite a different kind of multiplicity that representation itself edits out in its singularity?
And I think that's probably why I think a lot about museums, and I think about exhibits and the idea of curation, and the fact that we need more than one representation. So it's like the idea of putting together something, because I think that in many ways this book is highly curated and intentionally curated and intentionally centered on us. And I think that's where the power is. While it is representation, it is more than that, but I think that's the thing, is it's the context in which representation singularly, but really that's much more interesting within a larger context of a community. And that's why community is magic.
Yeah, but it's so true. And I think what is incredibly important about the book is that it doesn't define. So it doesn't say this is, it doesn't define an experience of disability, but it opens many windows into the experience of disability and many moments for empathy, but also for a unique understanding for somebody who is disabled or maybe isn't disabled. And I think that is incredible. And I'm going to end on a quote, actually, because I know we're almost out of time. Again, from your introduction, Alice, where you say that disabled people have always existed, whether the word disability is used or not. To me, disability is not a monolith, nor is it a clear-cut binary of disabled and non-disabled. Disability is mutable and ever-evolving. Disability is both apparent and non-apparent. Disability is pain, struggle, brilliance, abundance, and joy. Disability is socio-political, cultural, and biological. Being visible and claiming a disabled identity brings as much risk as it brings pride. And these words are incredibly powerful. And on that theme of representation, I think that through the sharing of personal stories, what the anthology does is to create an insight into all of these aspects of disability with generosity, with clarity, and with humanity. And I would hope that this work will become crucial in tipping that balance between risk and pride over in favor of pride. And I would encourage everybody to read it, because I think that you will be a richer person for having done so. So I think we're going to have to finish up there, although I would love to go on for longer. I'd like to thank you so much, Alice Wong, Eugene Grant, and Alice Sheppard, for what you've shared with us all today. And it's been a real privilege for me to speak with you. I'd also like to remind everyone that Disability Visibility First-Person Stories from the 21st Century Vintage Books 2020 is available online from the dedicated festival bookseller, Charlie Byrne's Bookshop, www.charliebyrne.ie. And make sure you also check out other festival events happening online over the coming days at www.court.ie. And finally, if you enjoyed the event today, please do consider making a donation to the festival at www.court.ie/support. us. Thank you so much
Thank you,
to all of
thank
you.
you, Jody. Thanks, Eugene. Thanks,
Thank you.
Alice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jody.
Bye,
Thank you,
thank
Eugene.
you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Alice.
Jody.
Oh,
Bye.
bye.